So Adam and Eve in the garden were given dominion over the earth. That was our mandate and our birthright. Satan comes in, messes that up. The Watchers come down. Humanity makes the deal with the daughters of men. The world gets worse than it's ever been. You know, arguably even to this day, worse than it's ever been in history. And God sends the flood to start over. Then the mandate is given again to Noah and his family. Replenish, fill, subdue the earth. You have what I believe is the sin through Noah's son Ham and a resurgence of the Nephilim DNA and all of the wickedness that went on. So that was Satan's next attempt there. And then, of course, you have the Tower of Babel. So you have all these events where the forces of darkness are trying to usurp the dominion that we are supposed to have on the earth. And then in Psalm 82, God says, you know, you will die like men. So he's talking to these sons of God that he put over these other nations. So he took Israel for himself, put the other nations with these other angelic beings over them. Then Jesus comes, and we talked about it with, you know, the transfiguration and the gates of hell. He's coming to take it back. He's going to draw all men to himself now. But each of those things, you can see how it's about the ruling authority that we are meant to have on earth and in the spiritual. So isn't it interesting that the word ecclesia means a ruling council, and that is what he said he was coming to do when he went to Caesarea Philippi? He's at the gates of hell, grotesque pagan stuff going on right in there, probably in their view, and he's saying, on this rock I'm going to build my ruling council, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I don't know if we've talked about it, but I've heard it said very clearly that gates are defensive, right? So this is an offensive from God and his sons and daughters. This isn't hell and we're able to withstand it. It's the gates are defensive, so we are on the offense. Welcome to the Days of Noah podcast, where we talk all things biblical, supernatural, and strange. This week, we're going to get into how one word mistranslated purposely in the Bible caused an incredible shift away from the ruling council that we were meant to be in God's kingdom. So this book that I sent you guys from Tim Kurtz, well, it's actually his free ebook. His Kindle book that I'm reading is called Leaving Church. Shoot. Let me look it up. Leaving Church, something Ecclesia, Becoming Ecclesia, or something like that. But let me just find it. Yeah, Leaving Church, Becoming Ecclesia by Tim Kurtz. And his subtitle, Because Jesus Never Said He Would Build a Church. And I was like, what? I just thought he said that. And you were saying something about something else you were reading.
There was a question in a church history book I was reading that asked about, it basically put forth that Jesus was a Jew of the Jews. He was very, very Jewish. And then it asked after that, did Jesus really want to build a group called the church or whatnot? And I know that Paul references the church in his letters, so I guess I would be kind of at a loss right now to even think about him not building a church.
Right. No, exactly. That's what I thought, especially like we literally quoted that last week on the show. On this rock I will build my church. So it was really fresh in my head. So then he's got a free, it's like 89 pages ebook. And so it's a shorter, kind of more to the point version. 7 facts why Jesus didn't say he would build a church and what it means to you. All right. So I love uncovering conspiratorial things or, kind of figuring that stuff out. Or if somebody else has figured out something, I love digging into those nuggets. So that appealed to me, and I was like, what is he talking about? Yeah, so the King James Bible, commissioned by King James in the 1600s, and you can look this up. He's got 15 rules for his translators that he wanted them to abide by, and most of them just make sense, as they're trying to do a good job. But one in particular was to translate using the word church instead of ecclesia. And so what's the difference? Because I've heard people say on YouTube and podcasts, I've heard people use that term. Sometimes, especially like if you've ever heard of the Hebrew roots movement, where people are like, hey, the Bible never says that we're supposed to stop keeping these laws. Why aren't we keeping all the feasts and everything, But I think especially in that, people say Yeshua instead of Jesus and Yod-Veh-Vav-Veh instead of Yahweh. Like they're trying to get more back to the roots of things. And so I think that's where I heard the word ecclesia in place of church. Well, they actually have very different meanings. And it's you can look purposely at the original language and go, is it just semantics, or did they actually choose something different? So the word church, I don't know if I can pull it up here in this ebook, but in Greek it is it's like korikon or something like that. I don't know if I can find it real quick. But anyway, and ecclesia means called out or assembly. So there are a few versions of the Bible that translate it as assembly or congregation, but almost every version we have calls it church. Well, what's the difference? Well, in Greek, it was that korikon, or whatever the word starts with a K. And that's not the word Jesus said and the New Testament writers said. Over 100 times they use that word. So it actually has the idea of a ruling council. And versus a church was actually more of a pagan concept of, gathering in a temple and kind of that whole structure, which the Jews would have been used to because that was the Old Testament way. You had the presence of God in the temple, that's where you gathered, and so on. So then you kind of wonder, is it a distinction without a real difference? But the reason King James apparently didn't want that word in the Bible that he was commissioning to translate has to do with his belief in the divine right of kings. So that idea that God, any monarch is commissioned by God in the place of God as a small g God. And therefore, what I say as a monarch is without question the law. And so a ruling council is something that would be a challenge to him. So he didn't want that. And he wanted this system with the bishops and so on where he had the control. And wasn't, so like the Puritans and like the Pilgrims and everything, wasn't that out of that same system that they left and came here?
Well, I know that the Puritans and the Pilgrims left because they didn't have the religious freedoms that they wanted to have. They had, they still had a Christianity basis, but they worshipped in different ways, and they wanted to put their lives together in different ways than was allowed. And I'm not sure if that had to do with escaping the Catholic Church or the Church of England, or which one. I'm just not certain.
Yeah, I think it was the Church of England. And wasn't it around that same time? Was it the 1600s? Well, you had Columbus, obviously, 1492. But then Pilgrims, Puritans.
Yeah, I believe so.
Is that about right?
Somewhere in there.
So, yeah, I wonder if that has something to do with just the kind of person King James was. Maybe if it was in his lifetime. I guess reading a little bit about him, he was well learned in scholarship and religious history and so on. So he was very well versed in those things. Not as much of a warrior type king, but more of a scholar. And so I think it was very deliberate, his choice. Oh, you looked it up. 1620 is when we came to Plymouth Rock.
It says arrival at Plymouth. The Mayflower arrived in New England on November 11th, 1620.
Wow.
Voyage of 66 days.
Yeah, so that would be interesting to explore that connection of what was church like in that time period. Around the time, strangely, that we have this highly venerated version of the Bible, which I'm not trying to disparage one bit. Because I look up to the King James version, and I think there's a lot of good things that came out of it that even some of our modern translations don't get right, but then there are things in our modern translations that do a better job because of more texts that have been found.
Well, and I'm one of those people who jumps back and forth between the different translations, because I'll be reading King James and feeling more spiritual, and then I'm reading it and I'm like, what did I just read?
Right.
And so then I'll go to an NLT or NIV or New King James,
right,
and figure it out at that point. But there's lots of I do have that great respect for King James version,
yeah.
And I even used to pray in kind of a King James way when I would be in real big trouble.
Sure. You thought maybe you were cutting through the mix to heaven a little better?
Exactly. That's what I was.
That's awesome.
That's what I was thinking.
No. Yeah, and so a few years ago, I was like, I should get a new King James because I don't want all the these, thous, ye's, and all that. I want it to be a little more common spoken to our language. And what I found is, it's that, but it's also translated differently. I wish there was a version, you'd almost have to do it yourself manually or something, that was the King James, but with those words removed. But then, I'm correcting myself, right? So then I learned like a year or two ago that it's actually good to have ye and those types of words in there because they're more precise. Because there are times where the Hebrew or the Greek is talking about you as in one person or you as in many, like y'all. And we don't necessarily have a good word for that in English as precise. And that's why, we do ye, but that's why those words were used. So if you see, thou and thy and ye, and there's like two versions for each, and one is when you're talking to one person, one is when you're talking to several. So it's actually more precise that way.
Well, and I think that the part of that type of language has a certain beauty to it and a certain kind of rolling off the tongue. I think where I run into problems in understanding certain passages has to do with kind of the syntax and the way that the sentences are put together.
Yeah.
Sometimes I just don't know what they're saying. But
right.
That's on me, and and when I don't understand something, I need to go look it up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know a lot of Christians talk about like God, the Holy Spirit, preserving His Word over the ages. And, how can we trust our Bible? Well, God would have preserved it. And I think as I've learned the last few months, it's not preserved necessarily in our language, but it is definitely preserved in Hebrew, in Greek, in those more precise languages. And so where we have translation issues or questions, we can go back to those. Yeah, so you looked this up. Why did the Pilgrims leave England in 1620? So that was only 9 years after the King James Bible was completed. They came in, of course, we heard this growing up in school, I think. I wonder what the history books say nowadays.
I think they change every once in a while.
They probably don't say anything about religious freedom or anything like that. They make travelers to the New World more of the bad guys, and some of them were. At the time, England required its citizens to belong to the Church of England. People wanted to practice their religious beliefs freely, so many fled to the Netherlands and, of course, coming over to America. So, yeah, I think that would be really fascinating to research what church was like then. But if you go back to the first few hundred years of Christianity, people met in houses, and it was very vibrant and a lot of freedom and creativity. And then it became more institutionalized with Constantine, making it like the official religion. And then, going back to meeting in temples and stuff. And I guess a little bit I looked up on him. He was like a sun worshiper. And actually even the word church has some relation to some pagan stuff having to do with that. And then, of course, we have, Sunday became the day of worship. So I think there's some ties to that. But anyway, that's kind of a little bit on my own journey of figuring out church or ecclesia. Because a few years ago I was reading, Francis Chan?
Yes.
Okay, so I was reading a couple of his books. One of them he's got called Letters to the Church. He's talking about going over to China, hearing about how they do things as believers. And then they asked him, what's it like in America? And he explains like our Sunday morning ritual with the services and music and the sermon. And they're like doubled over laughing like he was a comedian, because they couldn't believe that's what we do. And then even over there, when the persecution let up, he said that the pastors over there were really frustrated because people got comfortable and it was hard to motivate them. So that's some things that are going on in discussion in my family is this structure that we've been used to for hundreds of years salvageable? Or do you have to have an entirely new structure to be able to work? And then learning that this word was deliberately mistranslated, and what does that actually mean for, what Jesus was trying to build? So I was talking to my wife about this last night, and just kind of the big picture, right? So Adam and Eve in the garden were given dominion over the earth. That was our mandate and our birthright. And then Satan comes in, messes that up. The Watchers come down. Humanity makes the deal with the daughters of men. The world gets worse than it's ever been. Arguably even to this day, worse than it's ever been in history. And God sends the flood to start over. And then the mandate is given again to Noah and his family. Replenish, fill, subdue the earth. Okay. Then you have what I believe is the sin through Noah's son Ham, and a resurgence of the Nephilim DNA and all of the wickedness that went on. And the whole reason that Israel struggled with worshiping other gods and these other nations is because they didn't deal with them how God commanded to. Joshua did. He was, kicking tail against these giant tribes. But after he died, then we kind of lost steam there. So that was, Satan's next attempt there. And then, of course, you have the Tower of Babel. So you have all these events where the forces of darkness are trying to usurp the dominion that we are supposed to have on the earth. And then you have, Mike Heiser talking about another mistranslation, Deuteronomy 32. Most translations will say sons of Israel, but Israel wasn't established yet. And it's correctly translated sons of God. So he divides up the nations, takes Israel for himself. He says, okay, I started with, Adam and Eve. Then we had problems. Then I started with Noah and his family. Then we had problems. Okay, now I'm making a people for myself. Then we have problems. So then And then in I think Psalm 82, God says, you will die like men. So he's talking to these sons of God that he put over these other nations. So he took Israel for himself, put the other nations over with these other angelic beings over them. Then Jesus comes, and we talked about it with, the transfiguration and the gates of hell. He's coming to take it back. He's going to draw all men to himself now. Right? So now we're in a new age. But each of those things, you can see how it's about the ruling authority that we are meant to have on earth and in the spiritual. So isn't it interesting that the word ecclesia means a ruling council? And that is what he said he was coming to do when he went to Caesarea Philippi. He's at the gates of hell. There's grotesque pagan stuff going on right in there, probably in their view, as I've read some people describe it, at the gates of Pan, where Pan is worshipped. And he's saying, on this rock, I'm going to build my ruling council, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I don't know if we've talked about it, but I've heard it said very clearly that gates are defensive, right? So this is an offensive from God and his sons and daughters. This isn't, hell, and we're able to withstand it. It's the gates are defensive, so we are on the offense.
One thing that has come up over and over in the Bible and in my reading has been whenever something needs to be decided, they would always go to the gates of the city, certain gates where the elders would sit and they would make decisions on things. One of the ones I just got done reading was if a brother dies and his brother fails to take on the husbandly duties with the widow of his brother, he's brought to the gate, and if he still refuses, then the widow gets to take off his sandal and spit in his face, basically. Wow. in front of the whole congregation, if you will, or the whole gate. And so it seems like lots of serious things happen there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so that's I tried to get in touch with Tim Kurtz, and I'm gonna keep trying. He looks like he's in his late 60s, early 70s, African American guy. Him and his wife Carolyn, I think it is. So his Facebook is like Tim Carolyn Kurtz, I think it is. But that's where and then I looked up. He runs this thing called the Ecclesia Center. That's where I found that ebook, that free book. Gosh, and I can't even. Honestly, it's only been like a week since I discovered all that, but I can't even think of how I found it initially. If he was, maybe I was searching through my Facebook page or something. But anyway, it rang some bells for me because it was a couple years ago that I read, Francis Chan's Letters to the Church, and then there were some other books from George Barna and Frank Viola. Pagan Christianity was a good one. And then Frank Viola, I think, is the one that wrote Finding Organic Church and Reimagining Church. So I'm kind of going back to those Kindle books that I have. And at the time I read them, I wasn't really... I was very intrigued, and I'm like, yeah, I think this is right. We're not doing church the way we ought to, or the way the first couple century believers after Christ did. But that's a big decision. It's a family decision, of course, and I don't think any of us were ready at that point. But I'm personally feeling more of a calling to explore that, as messy and wild as that might be, because I think there's a lot of things about the way we've done church that they accomplish a lot of the same things. Like, they're not ineffective totally, but they end up being more inefficient, more limiting, and things like that. And so Yeah, I just find it fascinating that you have this word translated. You know.
Well, when I was down south, it was before I was saved though. But you go to churches and they have a different order of things down there in a lot of the places where they'll have a song or whatever, and then they'll have the children all come up around the altar, and then the pastor will just talk to the children in front of everybody, and then of course then the service would go on as a normal one. I think that the church devolves when there is national comfort, and I believe that the church evolves when there's horrible persecution, because my prayers right now are, Lord, can I play guitar better, or something like that. And in a persecuted country, it would be something completely different. I wouldn't even want to guess what it would be, but it would be completely different, and it would have to be done in secret.
Yeah, please help Brother Don not die as he tries to get a Bible to this Muslim that's interested.
Right, and yes, and pray that person, really wants that Bible, and they're not setting him up and our whole church up, and
for an ambush.
Yeah,
exactly. I was talking to my wife about this morning, like how much of our resources, time and money, go towards overhead in the traditional model. And I can't remember if it was one of these books that I mentioned from Frank Viola or George Barna or Francis Chan or some other place I read this, but Airbnb has more rooms than the Hilton in the world, right? And think how much overhead Hilton has. So it is just a much more unencumbered, unhindered, nimble force. It's a soldier with 30 pounds on his back versus a soldier with 120 pounds on his back. He's the 120-pound pack, he's got other things to deal with, other things to contend with. And I think all churches become that. That was one of the statistics that I noticed, or I found, rather, when we made a switch from our church 2 years ago to our current, was that when you get past about 15, 20 years old as a church, the focus becomes inward and less outward. And that's just a natural progression of taking care of the needs and desires of your congregational body. But I like how in Francis's book, one Chinese pastor put it, he said, I don't want my congregation members to be here for more than 5 years. Because if they're here 5 years and I haven't equipped them to go out and do ministry how they're gifted, then I'm doing something wrong. It's like we think in America like the good Christian thing is to be part of a church, or maybe you switch once or twice in your life, but you are a member and you are faithfully attending, and that's what you do your whole life. And I think it is very helpful and useful, and it gives, especially less mature, it gives us the spiritual milk that we need. But at some point, we got to have the meat, right? And, Francis uses the analogy of a zoo. You take the animals and put them in the zoo, and it's still a tiger, but it's not operating in the way that it was meant to in the wild. So it's a little messier that way, but...
Well, and my wife and I decided to leave our church. I'd been going there 20 years, and she'd been going there for a lot longer than that, since she was a child. And we left, obviously when COVID came in, it changed a lot of things, but it caused us to kind of have a reset. We didn't want to walk away from our friends and our family and our church family. And I hate to use the word feelings, because, we can't really trust our feelings on things. However, we just really felt like we needed to change and go to this other church. The new church we're going to has more of it has an outreach ministry into the colleges, and it also has one of the doctrines that they hold to is that it's not necessarily the 5 years, but and it's funny you say 5 years because there's a new pastor that just came, and he's training for 5 years, and then he's going to go to Milwaukee.
Okay.
And
plant?
And plant.
Wow.
And so all these, our churches looked at as, a mother church, if you will.
Right.
And wanting to have as many babies as possible.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And that's one of the things that drew us to the current place that we're at. So I think that church can be done in a way that is more outward focus and church planting and all of that. So it's not ineffective. Yeah, it's more of maybe less effective or more encumbered with the overhead of a building. And you think about it like, some of the things we talk about, well, church should be like this, it should be like that. Jed Payne on his podcast, he said, going through AA, he's like, church should be more like this. and so you might hear the common response, well, that's what small groups are for. Well, what often happens in small groups, unless you just have you really got blessed with a right mix of people, is we end up doing the same thing we do on Sunday morning. 80% of us are passive, and the other 20% are doing all the heavy lifting. And so you get people that don't talk, that don't share, that, it's hard to get people motivated. We're too comfortable. And then you have to ask yourself, why are we spending all this money so we can meet for a couple hours a week collectively, but then say the real stuff is supposed to happen in small group for free? That's challenging to me.
That is kind of an argument to be had.
Yeah. So anyway, these are the things I'm exploring, and I kind of feel like, personally, just in the last couple of years, not being able to assimilate as much as I've wanted to, like with the worship team and things, that maybe it's a little easier to revisit these things that I read about a couple years ago and seriously consider them for now, versus a couple years ago when I was, regularly serving and so on. I think that's definitely a lot harder to leave at that point. And like you said, you've got all the family and friends connections, and like it's a big culture shock to try to do something like that. But
well, yes, and obviously leaving a church, I was saved at a later age in life, and so I, in a way, had mentors, from that specific church that I, in a way, have. I don't want to say I've walked away from them, but when it comes to, and this is just an opinion, and please nobody get offended, but Christians are really weird when it comes to friendship.
Okay.
And it's my own take, because it's like you can be just tight with people for 20 years, and then all of a sudden you decide you're going to go worship down the street instead of with them on Sunday, and then everything becomes awkward and it becomes strange, and you run into them in the grocery store, and you don't know what to say, and the way that I would always hope it would be that when we're brothers in Christ, period.
Yeah.
But I do also understand that awkwardness, because when I was brand new in the church, brand new saved, and I saw somebody leaving the church, my first thought was, oh, are they even saved? They're leaving this church?
Right.
I mean, are you kidding? Yeah, exactly. And so I understand both sides of the coin.
Do you think people are almost defensive and in having like a guilty conscience, or feeling like they have to explore, that they have to be defensive or have a guilty conscience? Because if somebody says, especially in our case where we told the leadership a couple years ago, hey, we're not happy with a few of these things. We feel like this is not the direction that it ought to go. And here's this place over here that is more outward focused. Do you think when people hear that, they get defensive and they feel like they have to justify them staying in order to not feel bad? Because if you're right, if you're saying that to them and you're right, then why are they staying? Because they have to wrestle with that.
I think that the outward focus argument, I think, is really, it's a good argument, and I think people do leave churches for those types of reasons. However, I think it has to come home to roost, because you can be a part of any church and then you can still do your own outreach. And so the way that I would look.
Yeah, go ahead.
The way that I would look at that specifically would be, there's the two types of churches. There's the church that does outreach, and there's the church where you just kind of have sponges in the pews.
Yeah.
And I became a sponge for a long time, and in going to this other church, I'm starting to wake up in those other areas, but unfortunately, I'm still a sponge.
Right.
And so I still have a lot of growing to do.
Well, that's understandable, and I think we all have that to some degree. Yeah, I'm just thinking about like the awkwardness that you were talking about. Like, yeah, I think people feel when they hear your reasons, like if you're trying to make maybe a biblical case, let's say, or an evangelistic case that, hey, I'm moving on because you guys aren't doing something right. I think it gets awkward when they see you and they know that's your reasons, but they're still going.
There's only one person in our church that I know that ever left for a reason like that, who I believe really meant it. And it actually, tries to live by that.
Yeah.
I think it's too easy to make arguments that sound really good, but then
They're coming from the flesh.
And then
That is so easy.
Yep. And then when it comes down to, the boot leather hitting the road, it doesn't happen.
No, I know. That's just it. It's like you want to spread your wings, and then you end up realizing, wow, now I'm not doing as much as I was before, and the whole reason I left is because I thought I was going to have more opportunities, or I was going to be more free. I definitely think it's more vulnerable to, your own weaknesses and the enemy's attacks when you're going to try to go off on your own. That's for sure. And there is, elder oversight as well that you would want to have if you had a community of house churches in the area that, you met different places each week or something. You would hopefully identify people with that maturity, because the eldership is pretty clearly established. That's a way that, that the ecclesia is supposed to operate. But not in a hierarchical sense, in a overseeing, serving, shepherding sense.
Well, I think what you might be talking about is the church in the book of Acts.
Yeah.
Which, to an American who is privileged, and I say that I'm privileged because of just simply where I live, and the things that I have available to me compared to people around the world.
Right. Well, Luke says he's available, so I asked him to shoot us a link here if he wants to jump in.
Okay.
And I don't know if we'll get to the Tim Bentz stuff. We can see, but maybe let's ask him his thoughts on some of the stuff we've talked about this morning. Well, anyway, this morning we haven't got into any of the Tim Bentz Canaanite altar stuff. We might save it for next time, since we're into, we're 40 minutes in, and we just thought we'd just chat, even if you couldn't make it this morning. And we've been talking about ecclesia versus church, because I came across this guy, Tim Kurtz, and I don't know if you had a chance to look at any of the things I sent out on that.
busy week, and no, I
Yep, that's
didn't.
all right. But he's got a free ebook that I sent out, I think 6 days ago to you guys, that gets right to the point of it. But then also got some Kindle books you can buy that go into a little greater detail. But so Don and I were kind of talking about King James Bible, what was going on in the Church of England, the whole story of like the Pilgrims coming over and wanting religious freedom. And it's in that context that King James commissioned this Bible to be translated. Well, here's what's interesting. So he had some rules for how he wanted his translators to go about this, and one of the rules was to purposely mistranslate a word. So the word for church is, and I'm probably saying it wrong, but it starts with a K. It's like kurikon or something like that. And that's a Greek word. Well, that's actually not the word that Jesus used, that the New Testament writers used. They used the Greek word ekklesia. So church is where we get that, the Greek word from the K, and that has a different meaning, whereas ekklesia is more about being a governing body, a ruling council. Called out ones is how it's translated. And so I was talking to Don just kind of all through the history from Adam and Eve to Noah to Israel, like we were meant to have dominion. And then, like we just talked about last week, Jesus at the gates of hell, saying, on this rock I will build my ruling council, is really what he was saying. So we don't have to rehash all of that stuff, but that's kind of what I'm exploring, and it ties into some of these other books that I've gotten a couple years ago from Francis Chan, Letters to the Church, where he's talking about how different church is in like China, and how we're very, very comfortable in our Western way, and it's less wild and it's less free and creative, and so on. So, any thoughts on that stuff? I mean, maybe that's all new info.
Yeah, I haven't researched any of that. It maybe some questions popped in my head that I would want to know. I mean, obviously the pilgrims and those that were coming over to the New World seeking religious freedom, but if they're seeking freedom, what was the restrictions? What was maybe not persecution, but what was the limitations that they were experiencing in their countries, be it the Church of England, because it was the Church of England that was commissioning the translation of the King James Bible. So when you're bringing up kind of those points in mistranslation of the word church, which was done by the governing body of the Church of England, what were they trying to do to stifle the believers of that day, and
Right.
why did they want out? I don't have those answers.
Yeah, that was talking to Don a little while ago. I was like, I think that would be a good next step for us to figure out what was that culture like. Well, one of the motives was that, and there's a quote from King James here I can pull up, but he very much believed in the idea of the divine right of kings, and that idea that a monarch is basically a god on earth and not to be challenged in any way. And so that it has a lot of ramifications for why he would not have wanted the word translated properly, but instead church, because he wanted that hierarchy, and it has more connotations that way that would have kept people in line.
So maybe that's a clue then, that the monarchy that was even to this day present in England, the believers back then were like, we don't we don't want. I mean, look at the Old Testament, right? When the Israelites wanted a king because the neighboring nations had a king. And what did Jehovah want? He's like, no, I'm your king. You only need me. But he went ahead and gave him Saul. We know the whole story, right? Well, here, fast forward, a millennium, or so, we got the Church of England, and the people are like, no, we have Jehovah God as our king. We don't need a king of England. We don't need a pope. We don't need, we've got the word of God, and we want freedom. So
Right.
maybe it's as simple as that.
I think so. I mean, you look at the structure that, the reformers were railing against, right? So all the way back from, Constantine making the institution of the church, and how that changed what the first few centuries of believers were doing. So, yeah, I think it's a challenge to what Jesus was trying to rebuild. I also think it's interesting too. I was listening to Blurry Creatures episode 22 with Judd Burton, and he had this like 3 a.m. revelation. He woke up and he had this thought about the word Rephaim and how is it possible it's tied to where we get the word king. And so he did a search, and just a cursory search found like 80 references to like all these different languages have that same Ra or Re. Like in Spanish, it's Re. And then in Latin, I think it's Rex. So you have all this root word language that is tied to, Rephaim, right? Which were the Nephilim after the flood. So that's really interesting, especially because we've talked about it. They were set up as the rulers. They took authority upon themselves because they literally were demigods. So maybe that whole idea of the divine right of kings came from that idea. And on Jed Payne's appearance with Nate and Luke on Blurry Creatures, he's talking about that. He's like, how did the first kings say, I have a right to be, or it's going to be me and not you? Like, it was probably a bloodline thing, So, yeah. But I think that's really interesting how that translate into kind of the modern trappings of how we do church. And so it's something I'm exploring more, but so yeah, I'll send that to you guys again if you want to look into that. I think that's really eye-opening. But yeah, I would like to see like more of the culture that they were trying to get away from in England. Yeah, man, it's just huge ramifications for how we do things. So much tradition, so many rules of men in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and if we're ignorant to it, we have it. That's part of our American history,
Mm-hmm.
And rightly understanding church history and American history in that regard, it'd probably be, a worthwhile study.
Yeah.
So
I think so. Yeah, and then maybe for next time we can talk about too Tim Bentz's interview. I don't know if you had a chance to re-listen to that, but I was able to find the one that I listened to years ago with Rob Skiba, where he kind of lays out his whole spiritual battle stuff overseas, in the Middle East and Germany and so on, dealing with these ancient Canaanite altars, and then coming back to the U.S. and being worn out and tired and just wanting to go home. And God says, I have one more assignment for you, and says, I need you to go to Jekyll Island, Georgia. And of course, we know from history, from Dr. Laura Sanger from G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, that's where the Federal Reserve System was born. So incredible ties to ancient evil and, the stuff that got me interested in wanting to have these discussions in the first place, the Nephilim. That's what the Canaanites were. And probably the big word diaspora, the spreading out, because they were getting trampled by Joshua and God's armies, that they spread out, and some of them probably came overseas. We know that from Brian Forster's work, the elongated skulls in South America, right? The highest concentration of these beings was in Peru, but then also the Black Sea area. So we know that there was a migration. So these Canaanites, these giants, they moved all over the world when they were getting their tail whipped by Joshua and company. And here it is that I don't want to spoil it, but ties to the Federal Reserve. We'll save some of the details for next time that are pretty fascinating. But maybe we want to get into Dr. Laura's book too. Have you read that whole thing, Luke?
No, I didn't go in detail through it. I kind of skimmed different chapters. Certain chapters I did go through, but no, I haven't. I need to repurchase it, or even the Kindle version. I think it's $10 on Kindle.
Oh yeah.
Okay. But yeah, that's a resource. She did a lot of work to get all that info.
Yeah, that's a thick book. You gave me the paperback. Yeah. I wonder if they have an Audible. Me and Don need the Audible, or else we'll take a year to get through it.
I love the Audible. Yeah.
I do, man. You can put it on in the bathroom, on the commute. Mm-hmm. It's only lacking when you need to look something up. That's where. So a lot of times you can buy the Kindle, and then for another $7.49 you can get the Audible upgrade if it's available.
Yeah, that's how I did the Creature from Jekyll Island, because that's a thick book. It's a 24-hour audio recording. But I was doing busy work, part-time work, and just listening to that, and
there you go.
Amazing story. One of my favorites, and it's a true story. It's history. It's wild.
It is. Another thing he wrote, if you didn't know, was World Without Cancer, and he has a really it's funny to see the graphics and stuff, but he has an old, like, I don't know, 70s or 80s documentary. I think it's still on YouTube on that, and his discovering about amygdalin, the vitamin B17, and how it's like a heat-seeking missile for cancer cells. And this tribe over in China, that their whole diet was based on the apricot, and the kernels inside the pit have this vitamin B17, and no one ever got cancer. And so that's an interesting story in and of itself. You want to talk about conspiracy, Creature from Jekyll Island for sure, but then also his other book, G. Edward Griffin, World Without Cancer, because when they were trying to synthesize this as a drug, the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York deliberately falsified the studies to show that it had no benefit. So we can we'll save that for another show.
Oh, here's another one for another show.
Yeah.
So I heard this conspiracy theory very recently where if you've seen the price of eggs.
Yes.
So there's apparently ties to a food processor who, I guess these chickens are eating all the same type of food that are coming from the same company.
Yes.
And all of a sudden they stopped laying eggs right around last September. And then what ended up happening was you've had that big fire in that company that lost 100,000 plus chickens or whatever.
Okay.
And now the company that's producing all of this food for the chickens is upgrading in huge ways to produce eggs. So it's just kind of one of those strange ones out there.
Well, have you guys seen all of the stories of different food processing plants having fires and planes crashing into them the last 2 years?
I don't know about the planes crashing,
Yeah.
but I've heard that they've had a lot of fires.
Yeah, planes crashing into General Mills or potato processing plants, all this stuff. It's insane. Tucker Carlson has documented it. There's like a couple dozen different food places. I think just mainly U.S., but yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that
Something's
too.
going on there.
I don't know them in detail, but I've seen the report, and yeah, Tucker has reported on it. I don't. How is that not it's not a coincidence, when you have that many. I mean, I'm a fire service. Don, you're a detective. When you have repeating incidents going on, there's patterns forming, and somebody has to put 2 and 2 and 3 and 10 and how many fires, put all that stuff together and be like, there's a connection somewhere. And we know just from simple common sense, if it's dealing with food, whoever controls food controls the people, and I go to a small farmer for fresh food, milk and stuff, and how the little farmer has just been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and put out of business, and it's the big companies that are dominating the market,
Right.
which they have a monopoly on things.
And even more so with COVID, with the lockdowns, it was the large companies that were able to survive and consolidate. Just like Great Depression, you had the deep pockets buying up everything for pennies on the dollar. Interestingly enough, you talk about Israel being enslaved for 400 years. It seems like, from one thing I was listening to, that came about because of the famine, if you remember. And then Joseph, he was put in charge so that Egypt would flourish, and everybody had to go buy grain from them. Well, they had to sell all their land off. So they became indentured to Egypt. So that's how that slavery came about, was a consolidation of power and resources.
Well, yeah, there you go again. So it was Egypt that controlled the food,
Mm-hmm.
and then controlled the people around them.
Yeah.
And then during the Great Recession, 08, 09, you had all these banks fail, and if you've done any research on the FDIC, which is a total sham.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's not enough money in the
No, it's like a tenth of a percent.
It's going to 250,000 or whatever.
Uh-huh.
That's not enough. If one bank closes, there's not enough money to pay all the people in that bank.
No, not
but
even.
all they do is a bigger bank will buy up the smaller banks.
Right.
And there's a list you could look at: the big banks, the Chase, the Bank Americas, the Citi. It's the big guys that are buying up all these small banks. So there's, from that time to present, that's even become few and fewer and fewer.
And a big change with that, Luke, was I think it was the 90s that there was a law that separated investment banks from whatever the other kind of bank is, and that was repealed, I think, in the 90s under Clinton, and that's where you had Citigroup and these things form. So now they could basically do both things at once, where legally before they were not allowed to. So that plays a lot into it. But it's interesting that you bring up the banks right there as we're kind of wrapping up, because that's exactly the judgment that God had on the banks in 07, 08, and is directly tied to Tim Bentz's story with Jekyll Island. So, as a segue to next time, let's ponder that. And if you haven't revisited that episode with Rob Skiba, I think his show, poor guy died a year ago or so, but his show was I think Revolutionary Radio Podcast or something like that. So that'll be really good to go through. And then, maybe we'll dig into Dr. Laura's book, and we'll look at some of the Church England stuff just to get an idea of what was going on. I bet we'll probably find some similarities to the abuses that Luther was railing against with Catholicism. So that should be interesting. Yeah, should we wrap it up for there? Sounds good.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Well, thanks for popping in, man. I didn't hear from you, so I wasn't sure what to do. So I was happy to have Don here to chat church history and stuff.
Yeah, my phone was on silent from class, and
I forgot about that.
And I was in class 8 to 5 Monday through Friday.
That's right.
And just a lot of sitting, a lot of knowledge, a lot of notes, dealing with retired chiefs from New York City, fire department, New Jersey, chief from Texas.
Wow.
So a lot of knowledge, and it was an officer class for lieutenants and above.
Nice.
So people from around the country were there.
Yep.
Little smaller turnout than their last officer development class. I think they had around 650 last time.
Okay.
We had about 400 or something. The weather was weird out there at the beach.
Yeah.
It was really foggy. Foggy. Yesterday was cool and windy, and I did get out on the beach at least 2 days.
Are you back home now?
Beach walk. Yeah. Arrived last night.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, we got done with class around 5 o'clock last night and drove back.
Cool.
So, it's about a 3.5 hour drive.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah.
And so I think we're all set for the 26th Sunday afternoon with Jed Payne. It's going to come on, and we'll hear about his story. He, of course, is the host of Church and Other Drugs podcast, and he's got like 260 episodes. I think he's been doing this for like 6 years now. Because it was, I think, 4 years when he was on Blurry Creatures the first time. He had been doing it already for 4 years. And lucky guy.
I listened to his episode, the Blurry one, and so I probably need to tap into some of his podcast stuff. At least check out the titles.
Just go to for starters, listen to the Mike Heiser ones. Those are really good. Lucky Guy's had him on the show like 3 times. I sent a message to Mike, and I said, "Hey, I know you're dealing with cancer and you're super busy, and I'm like, but it would be such an honor. But I understand if you can't." So we'll see if he writes. Maybe he'll write back. We'll see. I think it's cool that he taught at UW-Wisconsin, UW-Madison.
Did he really?
Yes.
Huh.
Yes, he was a professor right here. So, pretty awesome.
Was that dealing with the Hebrew studies?
Probably. I would think that would be in line with what he's written about and stuff. So, anyway, let's wrap up for now, and we'll chat about what to chat about next week. All right.
Sounds good.
All right. See you guys. You've been listening to the Days of Noah podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. As always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions or comments or suggestions for the show at thedaysofnoahpodcast@gmail.com. And we will see you again next week. God bless.